Well, thank you very much indeed, Cecile, and a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Richard Calland. I'm the moderator of the session and the convener of this high-level panel, and I bring you greetings from a sunny but autumnal Cape Town in South Africa. This edition of the EDDs comes in the middle of a very significant year in human history. Not only is the world rebuilding from the biggest pandemic for a century, but it is facing multiple other system-level shocks and crises, including a very real climate crisis. It is an historic moment, a true fork in the roads. What happens this year, the decisions that are taken, the choices that are made, will set the course for the rest of a critical decade, one in which humanity must meet the urgent imperative imposed by climate change science and also reach for the 2030 global goals, the SDGs, agreed at the United Nations in 2015, the same year as the Paris Agreement on climate change. Urgent climate action and sustainable human development. As the G7 communique from Carbis Bay at the weekend stated, a green revolution is required. The communique said as follows: protect our planet by supporting a green revolution that creates jobs, cuts emissions, and seeks to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. This is the intersection between the climate change crisis and the human development imperative. How much will this green revolution cost, and who will pay for it? Two very important questions. And this high-level panel is focused precisely on this topic and these questions. Transforming climate finance to tackle the climate emergency and drive development. Shifting the global finance system to boost the green transition. I want to briefly introduce you to the panelists. I know Cecile has done so, but let me add a little bit more detail to their profiles so that when we get into the conversation, we can do so immediately and get stuck into the actual debates. First, as Cecile said, we shall hear from Amina Mohammed. She's the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, of course. She's no stranger to the EDDs. She's appeared in person at previous editions. Then I will begin what I hope will be a fast-paced, quick-moving, discursive conversation in which I hope the audience will join in by engaging Amar BHATTACHARYA in order to frame the issue and identify the most decisive factors that we believe will determine success or failure in the coming years. I say we because I've had the privilege of co-leading, as Cecile mentioned, with Amar, an expert group on climate finance that was commissioned by the UN Secretary General last year. Our report, published on the 10th of December, made findings about progress towards the 100 billion per year by 2020 climate finance target that was originally set in Cancun in 2010 and affirmed in the Paris Agreement. Amar has his finger very close to the pulse, several pulses, in fact, working closely with a wide range of very important actors in the climate and development finance spaces, including with Lord Nexter, following a long and distinguished career at the World Bank. He's now a fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Amar, for joining us. I know it's 4 o'clock in the morning or something like that in D.C., but you're no stranger to those early mornings, working on several time zones, as you do. After Amar and I have framed the discussion in the way I describe, I will then draw in the other members of this panel into the discussion. Firstly, Pierre Halbron, who is the Vice President of Policy and Partnerships at the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He serves on the Executive Committee of the bank and chairs the Strategy and Policy Subcommittee. Prior to joining the EBRD, he served for many years in senior positions within the French government, including the Prime Minister's Office and the Ministry of Finance, and was closely involved in the COP21 in Paris. Then Thomas Fekete, who is Head of Sustainable Investment Solutions for EMEA at BlackRock, a leading investment management firm, with $8.68 trillion of assets under management as at the end of last year. BlackRock's sustainable investing team is focused on identifying drivers of long-term return associated with environmental, social, and governance issues, ESG, integrating them throughout BlackRock's investment processes and creating solutions for its clients to achieve sustainable investment returns. Prior to BlackRock, Thomas was at Barclays, UBS, Morgan Stanley, and used to work in European telecommunications and aerospace. Welcome, Thomas. Tom. Lastly, I want to welcome to this panel EDD young leader, Ms. Nandin-Erdene, who is from Mongolia and works for the Mongolian Sustainable Finance Association, which is dedicated to developing the sustainable finance framework, working closely with public and private sector actors to design integrated policies and multi-sector initiatives that create positive change in line with the SDGs. She may be younger than the rest of us, but she comes with specific, relevant expertise. And I look forward to drawing her in to comment on what the more experienced members of this high-level panel have to say about the financing of this green revolution. Please do not hold back in offering questions and comments in the chat. As many of you, I hope, will bring your own expertise to this particular discussion. We urge and encourage you to engage with the conversation, to challenge the panelists, and to ask probing questions as we move through the rest of this session. Now, with the able assistance of the organisers, I'd like us to play, please, the pre-recorded message from Amina Mohammed.
Excellencies, dear friends, I'm delighted to join you for a timely and, quite frankly, urgent discussion at the European Development Days. Shifting the trillions so that financial flows align with the goals of the Paris Agreement is going to be crucial for addressing the twin crises of COVID-19 and climate change. This requires ambitious commitments from governments in their nationally determined contributions and 2030 targets to keep the 1.5 degrees goal of the Paris Agreement within reach. And it calls for financial actors, as well as real economy companies, to set credible and verifiable short-term targets and timelines for their portfolios and operations that back their pledges to achieve net zero emissions. We've seen many net zero pledges in 2021. Now we need to make sure these actors walk the talk and cut actual emissions without leaving any room for doubt. I know that you, like the United Nations, will be watching for the plans that will affect the change. None of this can make up for the urgently needed scaled-up public finance for developing countries to invest in mitigation and adaptation. Meeting the $100 billion pledge remains crucial. This is a collective promise that has been made by developed countries in Paris 6 years ago. This is a promise that we've not yet delivered on. The European Union and its member states have been credible partners on climate finance by contributing more than 20 billion euros annually in recent years. The United Nations continues to call for at least a doubling of public finance for all its G7 members. We have also called for a breakthrough in adaptation, as current levels of support do not even begin to cover the needs, and those costs will only grow. The world needs to see a doubling of climate finance contributions and a dedication of 50% of it to adaptation from developed countries. Predictability of finance is essential for developing countries struggling with multiple crises all at the same time. We look forward to having what the European Commission and Member States are planning to contribute to the 2021-2025 period. These investments in climate action will yield the dividends in robust and just transitions to green economies. This will support energy transitions, creating jobs for the teeming youth, providing opportunities for digitization and closing the gap and transforming food systems, ensuring the end of hunger, lack of jobs, and tackling sustainable consumption and production. At this pivotal moment for humankind, when pandemic recovery offers an opportunity for transformation, the United Nations looks forward to working with partners across the world to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and charter a healthier future for people and planet alike. Thank you.
So that is a very helpful, I think, and clear-minded statement of what is required from the perspective of the United Nations. Amar, I want to begin with you, as I said, building on Amina Mohammed's statement and noting the fact that, of course, this EDD edition comes just a day or two after a G7 meeting, one of the most important in living history, I think, living memory, in Carbis Bay in the United Kingdom. What do you think was achieved at Carbis Bay, and what more is needed?
So Carbis Bay was indeed historic because it did bring together the G7 around the notion that we have to respond simultaneously to these two crises, the COVID crisis and the climate crisis, and indeed other underlying challenges such as growing inequality in the world. And the way forward is through accelerated and high quality investment. That was a central theme of Carbis Bay. In that, there was a recognition that climate and climate finance have to be at center stage, and delivery of the 100 billion is important. So there was a clear and strong statement on the commitment to deliver, but not as clear and strong actions as yet to show that it is actually being backed up by country commitments. Some countries did come forward, like Germany and Canada, but others still have to deliver. And as the Deputy Secretary General said, all eyes are watching on whether the developed countries will live up to their commitments.
And the specificity in the DSG's statement there about the doubling of climate finance, the requirement to move to a situation where 50% goes on adaptation to developing countries, those are potentially very big shifts, are they not, in the international climate finance, public climate finance landscape?
They are indeed big shifts, but the bigger shift is the green revolution that the G7 called for. So if we are indeed to make what our moderator said at the very beginning, provide the trillions of dollars, then we have to think big about the totality of finance, and public finance and bilateral public finance is the foundation on which all finance, climate finance rests. So a doubling of bilateral climate finance is absolutely essential to move the needle forward. It's also very important that we move not just the quantum of finance, but we also move the composition and quality of finance. One very important aspect of that is to ensure that we have adequate finance for adaptation and resilience, and hence the call that at least the public finance should have this 50% goal in terms of serving adaptation and resilience objectives. But there are also other quality aspects that have to be addressed.
So your emphasis there, I think, is very important. In your first answer, you spoke of the acceleration of climate finance. You speak also of the necessary high-quality investment. So it's quality as well as quantity. Now, Amar, in our report last year, we spoke very, I think, strongly about the fact that the 100 billion commitment per year by 2020 is a floor and not a ceiling. It's a foundation, to use Amina Mohammed's word. What do we mean by this? And how should the world think about public climate finance and then, in due course, private climate finance in terms of the layers of the ecosystem?
Well, there are two ways to think about the 100 billion as a floor and not a ceiling. The first is the world is not the same even since Paris. In what ways? First, we know that climate change is here and is accelerating with severe impacts, especially on poor and vulnerable countries. So we need to significantly step up in terms of supporting those countries in adapting to and building more resilient systems. That's a significant addition. Second, we know that 2 degrees is simply not good enough. As, again, the Deputy Secretary General said, we have to move to a target of net zero emissions by 2050 in order to keep the 1.5 degree target at reach. For the world and for the developing world in particular, that means significant acceleration in key transitions. These are development transitions and they are climate transitions. So we need a very large amount of uptick in investment over the coming 2 decades. That's not about the billions or the 100 billions, that's about the trillions. So in order to do that, we need the base of the 100 billion, which is the international public climate finance, to grow in order to meet and respond to the ambition that is necessary both on climate mitigation as well as on adaptation.
Thank you. And lastly, Amar, before I move to the other panelists, a final question at this part of our discussion. I know you regard the MDBs as really critical actors in this ecosystem, and that they have to really stretch their game and step up their level of climate finance. Can you just say a few words about how you see the role of the MDBs in this coming crucial phase?
So when you look at the challenges around green and resilient infrastructure, we have kind of two gaps that we have to fill. On the one side, we have tremendous needs and opportunities for scaling up investments, but we are not able to translate them into realized demand, means translate them into concrete pipelines of projects that are financeable, as it were, because of policy and institutional bottlenecks, because of long-standing impediments in terms of capacity and the like. And the MDBs are critical partners in working with countries on their long-term strategies, in helping them to translate these needs and opportunities into realized demand. Second, they are powerful agents to help manage risk. They do that in terms of managing the early stage risk. Their very presence makes a difference. They can use specific risk mitigation instruments. And they do this not only with respect to early stage risk, which is extremely important, but they can even do that, as the European Investment Bank is doing, in terms of ensuring that long-term institutional investors are brought along. So they are the bridge in some sense between the demand and supply, and hence they play a very critical role in the scaling up proposition that is critical to meeting the climate goals.
Thank you very much, Amar. That very much lays the ground, certainly as to how you and I frame and see the key issues in this debate. Let me turn now to our other panelists and bring them in and see if they agree and see what they would like to challenge or add to this picture. And starting naturally, I think it's appropriate and easy segue from your last answer with Pierre Halbron from the EBRD. Mr. Halbron, I assume you're still there. Your picture seems to have gone a little dark, but can I ask you, you are the head of the strategy subcommittee of the BRD. When you think of oh, he's not there. Never mind. We'll come back to him. I'm sure he'll rejoin soon. So, Tom, I must jump to you then. The private climate finance piece is, of course, enormous. And I want to ask you about the scale of that and the sense of direction and whether we're going to get there. But first of all, BlackRock. BlackRock is regarded as a leader in this space. You, as an asset management firm, you've really moved way ahead of the field, so to speak. I'm going to ask you in a moment whether the field is going to follow you in sufficient scale and pace. But first of all, how did you acquire this leadership, reputation and brand? What were the triggers within the firm that made you tilt your approach to your portfolio?
Thank you, Richard. Really honored to be here today. So I think where we are today is a reflection of the direction that our CEO, Larry Fink, has had for the firm for the past 5 to 10 years. And in particular, he started, I'd say 4 or 5 years ago, communicating a lot about long-term investing and how that is critical to generate value and support the economy, and encouraging CEOs of companies we hold in portfolios to really focus on the long term. That was his first grounding message, which he followed the following year with a focus on purpose. And with that started to define the direction of having a responsibility as an asset manager. So we are an asset manager. We manage close to $9 trillion in assets of our clients. We only invest for our clients. And based on that, these clients are generally pension funds, insurance companies, so are very critical to society and very critical to the economy as a whole. Building from purpose, we started then 3 years ago announcing how we are coming to the realization that climate change is a major risk, and climate risk is becoming an investment risk. So there was not yet a lot of measures, metrics, financial reports that could identify for corporates or for governments in which we invest and lend and invest in equity as well, measures of how climate risk is reflected. And that's where we started investing massively in terms of new modeling, financial modeling of bringing in the various facets of climate risk from a financial standpoint. The first facet is physical risk, how climate risk can destroy infrastructure and the capacity of economies to generate growth. The second facet of climate risk is transition risk. How are companies going to adapt to a new version of the economy, which will be focused on a low carbon setup? So this transition to low carbon is something that we are convinced about. This is something we've actually built into the assumptions of what we call our capital market assumptions, how much each asset class is expected to grow and deliver returns, and what level of risk is associated with each of these asset classes over the next 3 to 5 years. These assumptions have been tailored recently by our CIO team to look at what the climate change implications are on these asset classes. And what we see is that we expect an improvement of an economy which is focused on addressing climate change by up to 25% growth in GDP over the next seven years versus a world economy that would not take into account climate change and not address it. So it is definitely a positive bet in a way to really engage in investing towards an economy that addresses climate change. Now, the final step we took last year is to commit to net zero alongside a lot of asset managers, asset owners, and banks. We have committed to net zero by 2050, and there are lots of steps towards that destination, but that is definitely a big focus for us.
So let me understand, there'll be lots of people on this call who understand the numbers and understand your business very well, and there'll be others perhaps less so. So what does this sort of shift in your portfolio and your approach to the management of your clients' assets, what does this mean in tangible terms? I want you to sketch a picture of how this translates from shifts in the direction of capital flows and investments into actual change on the ground. Can you briefly sketch that picture, please?
Absolutely. So there are two very important dimensions. One is there are red lines. We have agreed that the coal sector, for example, in particular thermal coal, is not a desirable sector to invest in going forward from a climate change standpoint and also from a financial standpoint. What is very important for those in the audience that are not familiar with this sector of activity, we need to deliver returns for our clients. There are savers, there are pensions, there are insurance companies who cannot make decisions to invest in assets that are not going to generate returns for them. So our main principle is the materiality of these sustainable risks, the relationship between climate risk and financial returns, and advising our clients that they need to take that into account. So for example, as I said, a red line around thermal coal, we are not investing in any company that are significantly involved in thermal coal production. Then the next big principle for us is to support the transition. So we're also looking at companies that are still somewhat involved in fossil fuel, for example, in relation to climate change, but are clearly indicating that they are evolving. They can do that by, for example, promoting and publishing what is called science-based targets, the way they are going to align towards a 2050 net zero economy. Utility companies, fossil fuel companies that have committed to aligning themselves to grow renewable whilst They are decreasing their involvement in fossil fuel. These are important actors of the future, and we want to support these companies. We believe they are going to generate good returns for our clients, and we believe they are going to be major actors of the future, having a competitive advantage versus those who are not engaged in the transition.
So, Tom, let me ask you this finally before I return to Pierre Halbron. The assumption, I suppose, is that capital is on the march. There are signs, positive signs in general, that were in fact affirmed during the COVID pandemic period last year rather than reversed, that this is the general direction of travel. But I guess the questions have to be, is it enough? Is it at scale? And is it happening fast enough? So will the tide rise with you? You're taking leadership in this space. Will the tide rise with you? And what will you do? What muscle can you show and impose on the market if, in fact, the tide does not rise and there are laggards? For example, asset management companies that are still investing in carbon, in coal. What will you do? What change can you invoke at that point?
I think that's where the partnership between public policy and private sector is critical. So yes, as you said, the tide is rising, and is it rising fast enough is your question. I think it is rising very fast, but from a very low level. That would be my analysis. I'll bring some examples to that. At the start of January 2020, we were managing around $107 billion in sustainable assets, those that really focus on climate and society. Within 15 months, so a little bit more than a year, this 107 billion turned into 350 billion, so more than tripled. So that's the fastest growth in any segment of the asset management industry. So it is attracting a lot of interest. But versus the 9 trillion that we manage, it is still a small sum. And that is reflective of the economy as a whole. I think we are already attracting a lot of interest from those investors who are somewhat convinced. Our job is to encourage the rest of the investors. And to encourage investors, we need a variety. There are 2 main concerns. First of all, private investors are still debating, am I going to sacrifice my returns if I focus on sustainability? And there's plenty of evidence, and that's what we do and other asset managers, to demonstrate that sustainable investing actually does not compromise returns. On the contrary, it protects against the downturn, and it also seizes opportunities to invest in those who will lead in the low carbon economy. But the second aspect of hurdle for private investors to accelerate this tide is the need for clarity, right? When we invest in particular in developing and emerging economies, the risk is high. So we need partnerships, and there are examples like the Climate Finance Partnership, which we've started with German and French governments to invest in infrastructure in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. So this combination of capital, blended finance, helps reduce the perceived risk for private investors. That's great. But also regulation helps clarify. So we are very supportive of the EU regulatory framework, the SFDR, the EU taxonomy, are bringing more clarity to investors, understanding what is sustainable, what is not, and therefore guiding capital in that direction. So clarity, incentives, and then the final piece of information that's really needed to accelerate this tide is more data, reporting by corporates to really bring information to investors so that we can actually detect which companies are really committed and which companies are less.
So, Tom, thank you. That set of final remarks, I think, aligns quite closely with the framework that Mark Carney has set out in terms of the COP26 private finance agenda, something I'll ask Amar about later. But Pierre Halbron, I think you're back with us now.
Yes.
Welcome back. I don't know if you heard my question. I put it, I think, just...
Unfortunately not.
Okay, so let me put it this way. Amar BHATTACHARYA ended his a set of answers to my first set of questions by saying that in terms of MDBs, there were two main gaps. One is in terms of overcoming the policy and other institutional bottlenecks, what I call the political economy of this landscape. The other was in terms of being powerful change agents to manage risk. And indeed, you just heard Tom Fagete from BlackRock talking about the risk environment and the need to have proper, effective public-private partnerships to overcome those risk blockages. You're head of strategy, the strategy subcommittee at the EBRD. When you look at the strategy of your bank going forward, does it align, does it resonate with those views of your role in this ecosystem?
Yes, clearly, yes. And as you know, and you reminded at the beginning, EBRD is not completely new to the climate field, and probably out of the multilateral development bank has developed over the last 30 years quite a lot of powerful tools and a strong track record on climate finance. Also because it was very much working in very energy inefficient, if you want, regions, Eastern Europe, Central Asia. So we've developed a lot of tools in that field. You mentioned these two areas, and Amar was very eloquent, I think, in pointing to the main challenges. First, risk and risk mitigation. I think it is one of the major added value of MDBs together with donors, and the blending model in concessional climate finance is quite fundamental to our business model as EBRD. Also working both with bilateral donors, the European Union being the largest of them, but also a lot of countries which were mentioned before, but also climate funds, multilateral climate funds like the Green Climate Fund or climate investment funds. We do that in a specific way, and I think it is important to underline that because we are very much focusing on the mission of crowding in private sector money. So it means more or less calibrating the concessional money to the real needs, avoid market distortion, and crowding in private investment. So that's one element, and we can go probably more deeper on that. Policy and reforms is also the second arm which we want to develop, and we've also pride ourselves in being part of the policy making. That requires a strong partnership with local governments and local authorities in the countries we operate, but also a capacity to advise them, to support them, and to deploy technical assistance.
Thank you very much. I want to put something else to you, Mr. Halbron. The Carbis Bay statement from the G7, the communique at the weekend, had some very specific words for the MDB community. Let me read from that communique. It says, we welcome efforts of the MDBs to scale up their climate and nature finance. We urge them to mobilize increased finance, including from the private sector, and we call on them, the development finance institutions, multilateral funds, public banks, and relevant agencies to publish before COP26 a high-level plan and date by which all their operations will be fully aligned with and support the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Now, to your mind, what does fully aligned with Paris mean? Because clearly there's significant meaning in those words. And can you, as a community of multilateral development banks, achieve it?
So two important questions, obviously, which require, obviously, a lot of cooperation.
Oh dear, we seem to have lost. Mr. Halbron, are you still there? We seem to have lost. Let's move on again. I want to bring in our EDD young leader at this point, Nandin-Erdene from Mongolia. A very good day to you. Thank you for being part of this panel. You are an expert in green finance. You work in the field of green finance. And I'm interested to hear your views. But perhaps I see, Mr. Halbron, you're back. So perhaps we should just finish off that. Are you back, Mr. Halbron?
Yes, I am. And if you can hear me, no, thank you very much. And very sorry for these technical problems. So alignment with Paris is really something we all aim. I think there is now a platform of cooperation and coordination among MDBs about how we apply more or less the criteria so that we measure and track more or less the same thing in a consistent, comparable, and transparent manner. This work has started in 2021, and I hope that I'm sure that in November for the COP26, we'll be able to announce also new steps in this alignment. This alignment should also be about how all of us, MDBs, but also all the actors you mentioned, work to support countries in developing long-term decarbonization strategies, either through economy-wide strategies, such as long-term strategies or national determined contribution, but also sectoral low-carbon pathways, which is something which is fundamental, as Amar mentioned at the beginning. So I think this requires a lot of coordination to be able to say, at the end of the day, we mean the same thing by aligning with Paris. And as you may know, EBRD has committed to do on all its projects, which it finances from the 1st of June, so 15 days ago, systematic analysis about the fact that we are Paris aligned, but also having the capacity to create platforms so that we can deploy at scale, more or less, the capacity of multilateral development banks.
So you speak of coordination between the different MDBs. That's been a topic of conversation for a long time. And regardless of what individual MDBs do and achieve, let me put it to you that, in fact, they generally fail to coordinate or cooperate well. Why is that? And is there any hope on the horizon of a shift, a real shift in the ability of the MDBs to work together in a strategic fashion?
So it depends, I think, very much on incentives and also a strong push from shareholders, I would say. I think each institution has its set of objectives, which are set by shareholders, which are among others, G7 members you mentioned, and which made these very important statements this weekend, EU member states and beyond the international community. And I think there are a lot of technical work which has been done among MDBs. I think sometimes what lacks is probably some division of labor, some capacity also to say some institution will not do that and will draw on the resources of the other to do that. And typically, you know, on the work on national determined contribution, which is one of the bases of the Paris Agreement, or the definition of low carbon pathways, I think there is the capacity jointly to do things much more cheaply and efficiently. This requires obviously a lot of engagement from each institution, and I think that has built up over time. And now I think, and you will probably see in November, that MDBs are able to take real commitments and afterwards to have the monitoring tools to apply them. And I'm sure also the summit, which is convening in Venice next month, back to back with the G20, will be able to open this that way. It requires a lot of also, I think, determination from shareholders who have to be consistent in what they require from these institutions they are shareholder of.
Thank you. I want to turn now to Nandin-Erdene from Mongolia. I was in the beginning of my first question to you, Nandin. You are an expert in green finance. You work in the green finance sector in Mongolia. And I'm going to ask you about the climate finance needs, green finance needs of your country in a moment. But first, as a young person whose stake in the future is even greater, far greater, in fact, than the rest of us in this session on this panel, from where you sit, from your vantage point, does what you've heard so far this morning represent a sufficiently ambitious agenda for financing this green revolution or not?
Thank you, Richard. To be honest, I can say this is an ambitious agenda. It's insufficient amount even just for climate adaptation activities needed by the world. If we look at the realistic scenarios, the 100 billion target is not reached this year. Developed countries' commitment to meeting the 100 billion target and further expanding the provision of climate finance will be crucial, especially in the challenging period ahead of us, given the imperative to scale up sustainable investment beyond recovery to enable all countries to deliver on more ambitious NDCs. Developed countries will need to continue to lead by further expanding their support in the period before the next climate finance target is set prior to 2025. And I think I don't want to repeat how insufficient if this amount is, but I want to tell that developed countries need to raise the grant component of their climate finance, as they are the principal source of such finance in the climate finance ecosystem. As you know, grant component is necessary to finance climate activities in least developed countries, vulnerable and poor communities, or risky projects where commercial returns cannot realistically be expected. And even some mitigation activities require high levels of concessionality. So as the independent expert group on climate finance, or you, calls out in your report, the 100 billion target therefore needs to be seen as a floor and not as a ceiling.
Thank you very much. And then turning to your locality, Mongolia, let's try and translate this kind of global system level conversation about climate finance to the ground in Mongolia, where there are, as you indicate now, significant adaptation needs. There are real needs in terms of the green transition. What are the finance pieces that you want to see there that would make a real difference to lives of people and their resilience and human security moving forward?
The last year, Mongolia sets a new target of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, reducing by 27.2% by 2030. And in order to achieve this target, we need 11.5 billion USD approximately. But climate financing is relatively new in Mongolia, and we have been introduced by the Sustainable Finance Principles in 2013. And since that time, all commercial banks in Mongolia are implementing Sustainable Finance Principles and environmental, social, and management system in their lending activities. And also, I'm happy to tell you that Mongolia became the second country that approved its national green taxonomy after EU. And after its approval, commercial banks started reporting their green loans to the Central Bank of Mongolia, and now the green loans account for 3% of total loan portfolio in the banking sector. But as green finance is evolving and developing much faster in the country, now the financial sector is moving forward to the climate finance. But when it comes to climate finance, we need strong policy and regulatory support. We need strong policies, regulations in place. Also, we need to introduce emission reduction tools, and we need to introduce also climate disclosure and reporting standards. We have to conduct climate risk stress testing for financial institutions, etc. So we also think about healthy returns, such as a pledge to boost green portion of the portfolios, we need to establish more public and private partnerships, like by developing pipelines of bankable projects and creating market structures to increase sustainable financial flows from MDBs and channel them into mitigation and adaptation activities. And speaking of public and private partnership, initiated by our organization, we have established first national green bank called Mongolia Green Finance Corporation, and the project has been approved by Green Climate Fund in November 2020. And I like to say that the MGFC, or Mongolia Green Finance Corporation, is expected to reduce GHG emission equals the 22% of NDC target of Mongolia. So financial institutions has a capacity to reduce GHG emissions. So I really want to say that the support from MDBs and bilateral financial support is very needed to countries like Mongolia.
Well, that's a very useful perspective from a developing country, a very clear set of observations about your landscape and what you require. Thanks very much, Nandi. I'll come back to you later on the question of how one fully, I suppose, aligns the development aid agenda with the need for climate action and climate finance. But let's keep that question on the back burner for now. There are questions coming in from the audience. There's a very good one for you, Tom, which I'm going to put to you in just a moment. But first, I just want to give Amar a brief opportunity to comment on what's been said so far, because I want to make sure that we have a debate here, that we don't all agree with each other, that there is a real challenge and no danger of groupthink. And Amar, you're welcome to comment on anything you've heard so far, but I also want to put a specific question to you, which you and I often debate. You from your home country, India, mine from South Africa, two countries that still have a very significant and unfortunate coal dependency, with significant public money still by way of subsidies for the carbon fossil fuel sector. Reading between the lines and even the actual words of the communique from the G7, it would seem that the language on policy reform, on incentives and subsidies is getting tougher in terms of saying, well, if you want more international climate finance, you need to earn it in the sense of making sure your own domestic house is in order in relation to this transition. Can you just comment on that?
Yes, Richard. So coal is the elephant in the room, and it is an area where I think the G7 did make progress. So with respect to the G7, there were two aspects. One is a commitment to cease coal financing effective 2021. That is a big deal because, the G7, particularly Japan, has been a very major exporter of coal-fired equipment. Korea, which participated in this year's G7, is also a major exporter. And the third country that's a major exporter is China. So the decision to kind of stop overseas financing of coal was a big deal. Second, there was a less clarity on domestic coal within the G7. As we know, it's a very politically sensitive issue, including with the European Union. But we are beginning to build a consensus that this is a transition that needs to happen and that needs to be managed in a just and fair way. And of course, this just and fair way is even more challenging in countries like yours and mine, Richard, because we do not have the same degree of support. We have to worry much more about safety nets, especially for vulnerable people in those sectors. But the reality is that if you make the investment, they more than pay for themselves. So what we need are two ingredients. One is strong upfront finance that can help manage this transition, invest in the good things and help phase out the bad. And second, manage the social transition that has to be, particularly ensure that the workers who are in the sector are not left stranded. But getting rid of coal is something that the world at large needs to do, including the big emerging market countries.
Thank you, Amar. And just speaking for my own country and not anyone else's, South Africa has been slow, but is now finally beginning to put in place the kind of strategic plan to illustrate how it will manage that transition away from coal and what the resource needs of that will be. But until now, it hasn't managed to put together that kind of plan, which I think has disappointed the international climate finance community. This is clearly an area where it takes two to tango, and there has to be a coming together from both the demand and the supply side. And frank conversation about how to achieve that is going to be a necessary part of what lies ahead. Now, Tom, I said that there was a question for you, and it's this from the audience. Does BlackRock still offer investment products that offer big financial return with only advice that is environmentally risky, ? Would you ever consider giving up on offering those products eventually? And I suppose the underlying question there is one I was going to put to you anyway, which is, are you willing to sacrifice profit in pursuit of this new social purpose?
So it's a great question, and a real life question where in practice we don't have, you're putting the question as if we have to make that choice. But in practice, we are so convinced that sustainability is the way for the future that we're changing the firm overall. And so the answer to the pointed question from the audience is, we are, there's no such thing as a product with high returns and where we say you can get these returns, but be wary. There are environmental implications which are negative. So we do not offer such products. First of all, the returns are never guaranteed. And second, we don't compromise on the environment. I think the main area where these products may be considered are where we build infrastructure, for example, in environmentally sensitive regions. And for many years now, our renewable infrastructure team, which is the only infrastructure team we run, has embedded the implications on the environment, but also the implications on the local communities as part of their decision factor to invest. Not only on day one, but they also then engage all along these projects to ensure that the operators that run these projects are respecting the conditions we've put into our investments. So that's one particular example, but more broadly, what we've engaged in last year across the whole 2020 was to make sure that every single actively managed portfolio at BlackRock integrates ESG data in their decision process. So there's no portfolio manager that doesn't look at the environmental implications of what they do. And we have also developed a valuation system which affects the likelihood of good returns because of the environmental or social risk that are attached to investment decisions. So I think this is the tide that is turning. What we've also done is that in Europe, to start, at least 70% of everything we offer to the broad public, 70% of every new product is focused on sustainability. The remaining 30% will be just generic products. They're not allowed to have like damaging impact on the environment. So we're committing, we're growing, but we need to follow, and that's the challenge I was mentioning earlier. How fast is this tide rising? We need to follow the regional specificities. The pace at which sustainable investing is growing in the US versus Asia versus Europe are different. And we have a huge role to play to open up the eyes of our clients, to convince them and show them that investing sustainably is a better risk-return decision. And that's where we put our efforts.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that very interesting answer to meeting head-on the question put to you. Thank you for that. We're coming to the end now, and I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to make a final remark. But with each of you, I'm afraid, facing a last question from me. Nandia, you shall go first, please. As I said earlier, and I warned you of this, I want you to give a final perspective on how you see the development aid and climate finance future. What are your expectations? What is it you want to see from those two communities in the coming years?
Thank you. I think climate finance need to be added on top of existing development aid flows and ensure that development finance does not decline as climate finance increases. I think that development finance should have tangible high multipliers and co-benefits, including all kinds of pollution, climate, and resilience.
Thank you very much indeed for that very succinct closing remark. Pierre, from an MDB perspective, and specifically your bank, let me ask you to throw your mind 5 years forward, or at least 4 years forward to 2025. It's going to be another important milestone for all of us. How will your portfolio differ then? What will be different about the way in which your bank is operating in terms of its investment choices, its concessional loans, and its commitment to the green, financing the green revolution?
I think that how I see more or less the integration of the green dimension to our operation, that it will be completely mainstream in all our operation. We are still measuring, the share of green project in our total investment. We did, for example, 2 years ago, 46%. Our friend from BlackRock mentioned also a share of the investment they call green. I think if we do what we commit to, in fact, all our investments will have a green dimension, either a climate mitigation or adaptation focus, and we will have more or less all our instruments aligned with to this goal, being able to add to our own investments the private sector investments which come together. And currently it's €1 of EBRD green finance, which crowds in €5 of private sector investments. I think this figure will grow, and I think more or less the green focus will cover all our activities and be completely mainstreamed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Tom, in 1 minute, what are you going to be focusing on as BlackRock in the run-up to Glasgow, which is going to be a really important COP for the private climate finance agenda?
So we're very proud to hear that the Glasgow COP26 will put finance at the heart of the discussion. I think this is a fantastic decision, and we're very much engaged with GFANs and other groups to advance that discussion. In parallel, what we are also very much focused on, we talked a little bit about public-private deploying capital to grow the green economy in ENDEs. We think there's another side to the equation, which is also to bring capital to invest in new technologies to decarbonize the economy. So on one side, we can invest in infrastructure. On the other side, we can invest in technology. And that's where partnering with other public institutions, such as Temasek and others, in the run-up to COP26, we want to demonstrate that innovation is also critical to solve for the climate challenge we face. So the combination of existing technology being financed and rolled out, but also investing early stage in growth equity and other asset classes to really bring these new technologies to bear, which are going to help us achieve our net zero 2050 goal.
Thank you very much, Tom. And Amar, in 45 seconds, what is your greatest ambition for COP26?
My greatest ambition for COP26 is a new trusting relationship and partnership between developed and developing countries and between the public and the private sector. Investment and innovation indeed will be key, but for emerging markets and developing countries, the challenge will continue to be availability of finance and the cost of that finance. The kind of shifts that we have heard from here can make a difference but the starting point must be not just delivering on, but building on the ambition of the 100 billion.
Thank you very much indeed, Amar, and thank you all. As Amina Mohammed said, the COVID-19 pandemic provides an opportunity to build back better, or as I prefer to put it, build back differently. The new economy, the post-COVID economy, has to be substantially and structurally different. To return to the old economy would be to return to the economic development pathway that got us into trouble in the first place, including the threat to our biosphere caused by the failure to respect natural planetary boundaries. That is why we need a green revolution. To achieve it, we need a massive shift in the whole financial system, starting with public climate finance and the 100 billion per year by 2020 commitment, which must be honoured if COP26 is to be a success, and continuing with far greater levels of ambition in bilateral, multilateral climate finance, and especially in concessional finance. MDBs must up their game, deploy their balance sheets, creating new instruments to galvanise and drive the transition away from carbon-intensive economic activity, such as energy and transport, and to enable private finance investment to come, to turn the billions into the trillions. Climate must be aligned with development. All sources of finance must be deployed in service of this green revolution. That is the strategic challenge, the strategic imperative, and the strategic opportunity. One that I hope this edition of the EDDs will wrestle with seriously, and one that I hope that this panel has helped to stimulate. I thank all of you very much indeed for joining us, and I hope that the rest of this EDD will be successful, interesting, and effective. Cecile, back to you.